The story of the late Middle Ages is not a simple one. It is a story of collapse and rebirth, of unimaginable tragedy and extraordinary resilience. The 14th and 15th centuries stand as a bridge between two worlds, the medieval order that had dominated Europe for nearly 1,000 years, and the dawn of a new age of discovery, science, and humanism. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we often think of knights in shining armor, castles, and cathedrals reaching for the heavens. But the late Middle Ages was different. It was a time of hunger, plague, and war. It was a world in which death was always near, and yet a world where people began to dream bigger, to question, to imagine life in new ways. In this journey, we will step into the heart of the 14th and 15th centuries. We will witness the Great Famine, when crops failed and millions starved. We will walk through the plague-stricken streets of Florence and Paris, where the Black Death wiped out entire families. We will march alongside soldiers in the 100 Years' War and listen to the cries of peasants rising up against their lords. And finally, we will stand in Florence and Venice at the birth of a new age, the Renaissance, when art, science, and human thought began to transform the world. The first catastrophe struck in 1315. The weather turned against humanity. Rains fell endlessly, soaking the fields of northern Europe. Summers were cold, winters bitter, and the harvests rotted in the ground. Bread, the staple of medieval life, became scarce. Prices skyrocketed, and people soon found themselves unable to buy enough to eat. The famine spread across England, France, the Low Countries, parts of Germany, and Scandinavia. Chroniclers recorded heartbreaking scenes. In one account from Flanders, mothers abandoned their children, unable to feed them. In another, starving men dug up buried animals or resorted to eating cats, dogs, and even carrion. Some whispered of cannibalism in the darkest corners of desperation. The death toll was staggering. Historians estimate that up to 15% of the population in Northern Europe perished. Villages were abandoned, farms left to weeds, and the famine left a lasting scar on European society. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making populations more vulnerable to disease in the decades ahead. The Great Famine revealed the fragility of medieval society. For centuries, Europe had grown in population and prosperity. Towns had flourished, trade had expanded, and people believed in steady progress under God's order. But in just 3 years, that confidence was shattered. It was a reminder that human life in the Middle Ages depended utterly on the forces of nature. In 1347, a silent killer arrived in Europe. It came from the east, traveling along the trade routes of the Silk Road. In October of that year, Genoese ships docked at Messina in Sicily, carrying not only cargo but death itself. On board were sailors sick and dying, their bodies covered with black swellings. The disease spread quickly, carried by fleas that infested rats, by contact between people, and even, some believe, through the very air. What followed was one of the greatest catastrophes in human history, the Black Death. Within just 4 years, between 1347 and 1351, it swept through almost every corner of Europe. From Italy to England, from Spain to Germany, entire communities were wiped out. The symptoms were terrifying. Victims first felt fever and chills. Soon, buboes, large, painful swellings in the armpits and groin, appeared. Many coughed blood. Death often came within 2 to 3 days. Doctors, powerless to stop the disease, wore long robes and strange beak-like masks filled with herbs, hoping to filter out the poison in the air. Chroniclers left haunting descriptions. In Florence, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio noted that brother abandoned brother, and fathers abandoned children. The sick were left alone, and many houses were left empty. In London, corpses piled so high that cemeteries could not hold them. In Paris, over 800 people died each day at the height of the plague. The psychological impact was profound. The Church, which had been the anchor of medieval society, could not explain why God had unleashed such horror. Priests died alongside peasants, and many questioned their faith. Some people turned to flagellation, whipping themselves in the belief that suffering would earn God's mercy. Others gave in to sin, reasoning that death was inevitable. By the time the first wave subsided in the early 1350s, between one-third and one-half of Europe's population, perhaps 25 to 50 million people, lay dead. And the plague did not vanish. Outbreaks returned again and again throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, haunting generations. The Black Death transformed Europe. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Surviving peasants could demand better wages, and the old feudal order began to crumble. Landlords faced ruin, cities struggled to rebuild, and society itself was reshaped. While plague ravaged the land, war brought further misery. In 1337, England and France entered into a conflict that would last, on and off, for more than a century. The Hundred Years' War was not one battle, but a long struggle for power, land, and legitimacy. At first, the English gained great victories. At Crécy in 1346 and at Poitiers in 1356. English longbowmen destroyed French knights, proving that the age of armored cavalry was waning. New technologies, like the cannon, began to appear on the battlefield, but France, too, had its moments of triumph. By the early 15th century, a peasant girl named Joan of Arc inspired her people. Claiming visions from God, she led French forces to victory at Orléans in 1429. Though captured and burned at the stake in 1431, Joan's martyrdom fueled French resistance. By 1453, the war ended with France victorious, and England left with only Calais. Meanwhile, ordinary people grew restless. The heavy burden of war taxes and the constant presence of death led to uprisings. In 1358, French peasants rose in the Jacquerie, destroying noble estates before being crushed. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw thousands march on London under Wat Tyler, demanding freedom from serfdom. Though suppressed, these revolts revealed a new spirit. Common people were no longer willing to suffer in silence. Despite famine, plague, and war, the late Middle Ages was not only a time of death, it was also an age of creativity and intellectual ferment. Universities in Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and Prague trained scholars who debated philosophy, theology, and law. Figures like William of Ockham challenged traditional views, insisting that reason and logic must have a place alongside faith. In Italy, a new cultural movement began, humanism. Thinkers like Petrarch rediscovered the works of ancient Rome and Greece, celebrating the dignity of man and the power of classical learning. Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy painted a vivid picture of the afterlife, while Boccaccio's Decameron portrayed human life with humor and realism. Art also underwent a revolution. Gothic cathedrals soared with pointed arches and stained glass that filled interiors with colored light. Painters like Giotto introduced perspective and emotion, breaking away from rigid medieval forms. Music flourished, with polyphony transforming church choirs into rich harmonies. Even science advanced. The invention of mechanical clocks changed how time was measured. Eyeglasses improved vision. Mariners experimented with better ships and navigation tools. Though small, these innovations hinted at the great transformations to come. By the 15th century, the world was changing once more. In Florence, a city-state of merchants and bankers, artists, and scholars gathered under the patronage of the powerful Medici family. Brunelleschi built the great dome of Florence's cathedral. Donatello sculpted lifelike figures. A young Leonardo da Vinci studied anatomy, machines, and painting, preparing to reshape art and science forever. The printing press, perfected by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450, unleashed a revolution of knowledge. For the first time in history, books could be produced in large numbers, spreading ideas across Europe. Meanwhile, explorers looked outward. By the late 15th century, men like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Bartolomeo Diaz set sail into the unknown, beginning the Age of Discovery. The Middle Ages were ending. A new age was being born. The Renaissance was not a sudden break, but a transformation built upon the struggles of the late Middle Ages. The famine, the plague, the wars, all had weakened the old order, forcing change. From death came life. From despair, renewal. The late Middle Ages was an age of crisis, but also an age of beginnings. It was a time when Europe faced its deepest darkness, and yet from that darkness emerged the light of the Renaissance. The hunger, the plague, the endless wars, all were trials that reshaped society. And out of those trials rose a new Europe, curious, ambitious, and ready to step into the modern world.